As you know, our island home of Maui is indeed a place of culture, indeed a place of proud heritage, of spirituality, and of scientific history of major significance. Truly, it is the inspirational backdrop to foster advances in modern science filled with a spirit of collaboration, international collaboration, and respect. Many individuals and companies and other organizations have made AMOS 2017 possible. First of all, we would like to acknowledge our very generous sponsors, beginning at the Melanoma level. Let me read them, please. AI Solutions, Applied Optimization, ASRC Federal, Braxton, Celestron, Exoanalytics Solutions, HNU Photonics, our homegrown company, Japan Space Forum, New Production Concert, Officina Stellar, Say Government Solutions, Sierra Nevada Corporation, Software Bisq, Solars, Toptica Photonics, and Tyvac. Next, the Kupua'a level, Applied Defense Solutions, Ball Aerospace, CACI, Northrop Grumman, Orbital ATK, Space Foundation, and Space Nav. At the Lokahi level, we thank our own County of Maui, Analytic Graphics, Inc., Harris Corporation, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Secure World Foundation, and our own University of Hawaii. At the Laulima level, our deepest appreciation to SAIC for their very generous sponsorship. And finally, at the Po'okela level, mahalo to the Boeing Company. Would all of our Boeing representatives please stand so we can acknowledge your support of AMOS 2017? Thank you to our 26 exhibitors. We encourage all of you to spend time in our exhibit hall. Thank you for helping us sustain the momentum built over the past 18 years. Please give them a hand as well. Our AMOS Conference team, led by Sandy Ryan and Leilani Hearn, have been working tirelessly for months with our conference chair, Paul Kervin, to make this the best conference yet. Paul, thank you so much. Would you please stand to be recognized, as well as Sandy and Leilani? Paul has been a very important partner, and we have others here today. Thank you to the Air Force Research Laboratory. So many individuals are part of our process and our extraordinary conference. We would like to say a special thank you, and to do that, we would ask Commander Eric Stockham if you would please stand and accept our thanks to your entire team. Thank you for your partnership. As mentioned by Reverend Alika, we want to extend a warm welcome to our 100 participants who made the long journey to Maui from countries this year across the globe. Given the importance of international collaboration and cooperation in space as we move forward SSA, their participation, your participation, is extraordinarily valued. Thank you, Ikomomai to Maui, to our international partners. Thank you to all the authors who contributed. We received 159 technical abstracts this year of excellence. That is another AMOS conference record. Thank you. It's not only assuring the technical excellence that the AMOS conference has come to enjoy, but it also gives you, our conferees, an expansive range of topics in the presentations and poster sessions. Let's give all of that hard work a hand. And And we also want to thank our hosts, the Wailea Beach Marriott Hotel, staff for their gracious hospitality. Many of you who were here with us last year know that the hotel was undergoing renovations, some of them a little painful and a little loud, but boy, was that payoff worth it. I know you're enjoying these fabulous facilities. Thank you again to the Marriott staff. Let's give them some applause. Every year we ask for your feedback, and I really want to take the time to underscore that. We not only ask, but we use it. Please take the time and share your comments very candidly, because your recommendations are the guiding insights that will shape AMOS 2018, which I hope you're already putting on your calendar. And it will assure that we remain your preeminent conference in space situational awareness. Now it is my pleasure to welcome a great friend and mentor to the AMOS Conference stage, Kirk Lewis. Kirk has been involved in the space business, as he tells us, for over 35 years, quite a milestone, ranging from being on the Joint Chiefs Staff for Arms Control at the White House level, and for the last 20 years as Executive Director for the Space Command, Global Strike Force, and GPS Independent Strategic Assessment Groups at the Institute for Defense Analysis. And in that capacity, he has been involved in over 225 assessments. Please help us welcome back to the AMOS Conference stage our good friend and mentor to introduce our keynote speaker, Kirk Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a great day to be in Maui again and back at AMOS. It's hard to believe that I've been here for 16 times, missed one, and hopefully won't have any misses in the future. It's such a great opportunity. Leslie gave you a snapshot of today's conference. And as been stated, this conference is about collaboration. And for those new, please connect with past attendees. And for those longtime attendees, please take the time to learn from our new participants of their current experiences, work and help satisfy their quest, and learn from you. And this has been a very key element in our success over time. And of course, the good news is our technologies through social media and things of that nature have greatly facilitated that. And as time has proven, collaboration is the key to innovation. And it's new innovation that's critical to our long-term space contribution for all operational success. Again, I have the privilege to introduce Doug Loverro, who I've had the privilege of knowing for a few years and had the opportunity to work with him. And for those who know Doug, will attest to the fact of his being a very bright and smart doer. During his Air Force career, he made extensive contributions to our current and future space systems, from the invention of the supersonic chemical oxygen iodine laser, the initiation of the DoD Global Broadcast Service as program manager of GPS, and most recently, being the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Space. From turning the wrench to understanding the policies, Doug has experienced it all. And it's important, even though he's no longer currently employed, we can anticipate that he's going to continue to give us a contribution to the activities that will increase our space capabilities now and in the future. And having known Doug as long as I am, I was thinking about, well, how did he become so bright and smart about these things? And then I was reminded about being in the Army that I was, about General George Patton's famous principles. And one of those principles is there's brain power through lung power. Oxygen feeds the brain, and here this morning I see Doug out running, getting that oxygen so that he can handle the questions that you're going to hopefully give him as we go along. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome again Doug Loverro.
It's great to be able to rejoin you all back here in Maui for this conference, and I want to thank Leslie and Sandy and Jeannie for inviting me back here again today. This is fantastic. And although Kurt seemed to say that I was without a job, I actually have a job, which is taking care of my wife doing her job. which believe me is breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. Having to cook is a tough thing to do. No, seriously, I want to spend some time with you today to talk a little bit about space policy, but I want to give you three things first to begin. A couple of years ago, I was here and I stood up on stage here with a jacket and tie on. And, I just looked completely out of place, plus the fact I was sweating mercilessly. So last year, when I came here, I said, I'm going to dress Hawaiian style, and I had the shirt hanging out. I had the leis on, as long with these things. I think I may have had sandals and a Mai Tai in my hand. I'm not exactly sure. But when my wife saw the video, she said, you're looking a little too informal. So this time, I tucked in the Hawaiian shirt, closed-toed shoes, so I'm formally dressed for Maui today. Number two, for those of you, it's a little early on Maui time here. For those of you who partied till the clock broke in the Boeing suite last night. So if you've read the article that I wrote in Space Review, or you were at the Nebraska Space Law Conference last year, just take a snooze. Half an hour from now, we'll ring the bell. You can get up and you can go ahead and ask some question if you feel so inclined. But otherwise, you don't need to pay attention. And lastly, and seriously, I am no longer, as Kurt said, I am no longer employed by the U.S. government. I am a private citizen. So the remarks that I give here today are my ideas, do not represent the thinking of the U.S. government. Now, I hope that one day they do represent the thinking of the U.S. government. But for right now, I am representing just myself. As people say, where are you from? I say I'm Doug Loverro, and I'm from the company of Fairfax, Virginia, and that's who I take credit for. So with that, let me start out. Let me tell you the story that got me thinking about these problems. Several months ago, the Secure World Foundation asked me to be one of their representatives to the UN Conference on this, or the UN Institute of Disarmament, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty. Many of you, I'm sure, know this, but perhaps some do not. The Outer Space Treaty came into force almost 50 years ago this month. It's actually next month. 50 years ago next month, the Outer Space Treaty came in forth, and the UN Institute for Disarmament was having a conference to go ahead and talk about the progress that we've made and where we need to go next. And so I attended that conference, and I want to thank Secure World Foundation for sponsoring me for that. It was a fantastic opportunity. And I wish I had gone to such a conference when I was actually in the job of space policy, because what I found out at the conference was two things. Two things that I heard at the conference. Number one, I heard a very active and very engaged, non-aligned set of nations, China and Russia especially, talking about the fact that the Outer Space Treaty had kept space, had become too old, didn't represent the kinds of things we needed to do in space in the future, and that because of the threats of ASAT weapons and those kind of things, we needed to go ahead and figure out ways to ban all weapons in space. And over the years, there have been several proposals to do so. One of those is called the Prevention of the Arms Race in Outer Space, which is called PAROS, which was passed just about every year since 1982. For those of you who are keeping count, that's 25 years ago. Passed by the UN General Assembly every year for the last 25 years, but then died in the Conference on Disarmament, or the Russian-inspired Treaty for the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, or the No First Placement Pledge that the Russians also put forward. And in every case, the U.S. in the past has gone ahead and opposed these treaties, but the U.S. at this conference said nothing. They didn't even have an official position on any of these things. And that was disturbing to me, that we were not taking the lead, because quite frankly, in 1967, when we created the current Outer Space Treaty, which really the work had begun many years before, the US and the Soviet Union and the UK were the leaders in promulgating the ideas which went ahead and became the 17 articles of the Outer Space Treaty. And the second thing that I heard at this conference was that everybody at the conference universally had concluded that the Outer Space Treaty was responsible for the fact that we had had no conflict in space for the last 50 years. And I was taken aback by that, because I said, no, it's not. That's not the reason why we didn't have conflict in outer space for the last 50 years. The Soviet Union and the United States both developed anti-satellite weapons back in the Cold War days. The reason we didn't have conflict in space was A, because only two nations had the ability to do it, and B, because deterrence was operative in space. Because we didn't want to go ahead and attack things in space, because we knew that all of those things that we as the United States or the Soviet Union had in space were linked to nuclear war or to major conflict, and if we attacked any of them, it would be seen as a prelude to a potential nuclear strike. And so what kept us from having conflict in space was nuclear deterrence extended to space, not because there was an outer space treaty, which, by the way, does not restrict outer space to peaceful use. It does restrict the moon and asteroids to peaceful use, but it emphatically and specifically did not restrict space to peaceful use, because when we signed the treaty, we already had military missions in space. So I heard those two things and I said, this is wrong, and why isn't the US taking the lead in these things? Why aren't we promulgating new ideas for the international community? Because if we really want to go ahead and advance US interests, we can't just sit back on our hand and oppose Chinese or Russian initiatives. We have to lead the new ideas that will lead to the next half century of progress in space. And so I began to think of, what are those ideas? What should those ideas be? And in order to go ahead and figure out where you want to lead, you got to figure out, well, what are your interests? What are your primary interests? What does the US want to get accomplished in space? And there's two primary interests that I would talk about. And it's funny because a lot of folks would say, well, maybe we haven't chosen where to lead because we can't agree on those primary interests. But that's actually incorrect, because we know what our primary interests are in space. As a nation, they have been the same since President Reagan's space policy, President Bush #1 space policy, President Clinton's space policy, President Bush #2 space policy, President Obama's 3 space policy, and if the Trump administration comes out with a space policy, I'm sure they'll be consistent as well. And in fact, if you go all the way back to the Eisenhower era, those principles and those interests have been more or less consistent with one another, except for the addition of commercial activities somewhere in that first 25 years. So what are those interests? And if you look at what we do in space today, those interests for US predominantly fall in two areas. Number one, the biggest boom to the United States in the future that has to do with space has to do with entrepreneurial exploitation of space. The fact that we will find commercial ways to exploit space, which may include mining, may include tourism, may include exploration, may include science, may include communications as it does today, remote sensing, all sorts of services. Number one, we need to make sure that that international law is consistent with US entrepreneurial needs in space, US commercial interests in space, and to the extent that it's not, we need to promulgate principles for that. And number two, we have an overriding national security interest in space. Space is going to be used for national security, and we want to make sure that it's safe for our national security activities, which may include things that extend to anti-satellite activities and conflict in space. And we need to make sure that that those things are understood. And in fact, oftentimes when I get to this point in this talk, people say, are you proposing that we should allow conflict in space? And my answer to that question is, absolutely. In fact, it's foolhardy not to recognize that conflict will someday extend to space. We know that conflict is going to extend to space because the following conditions are true. The US uses space to go ahead and make our military more effective. We go ahead and try to eliminate our adversaries' capability and national interest by using space as a gun site, sometimes as the actual means to direct weapons to space, to go ahead and find out what's going on in their nations. We use it for our national security interests, and therefore, if you're a foreign adversary and you can interrupt that kill chain, how can you possibly convince your citizenry that you shouldn't do that? More to the point, for the US, if we know that an adversary is using space to go ahead and target our sailors, our soldiers, our troops, our interests around the globe, and we didn't take the actions to deny that use of space, and we lost a carrier in the Pacific because of that, how would we ever explain to the American people, or to the British people, or the Japanese, or the Russians or the Chinese, that we couldn't save 3,000 lives on a carrier because we weren't allowed to target a satellite that otherwise could have been eliminated the effectiveness of that strike. Of course we have to do it. It's the sovereign responsibility of every nation to take those actions. And so the reason why the Paris discussions have failed for the last 25 years isn't because that the resolution isn't supported by a whole bunch of disarmament people. It's because it doesn't make sense. It's not in the national interest of the US or other nations. And so we have two primary principles. A, how do we make sure space can support the entrepreneurial commercial activities that the US needs to lead in? And B, how do we make sure that we set up the right conditions for national security and interest in space to continue to be exercised? And from those two major principles and major goals, I came up with what I thought were four what I called principled principles. And the reason I call them principled principles is because they're based upon the same kind of rules and laws that we use on the terrestrial surface to go ahead and determine how do we do things that help US commercial interests and US national security interests. So let me walk through those four things that we need to do. First, if we admit that there's likely to be conflict in space, what we really need to do is we really need to figure out how do we assure that that conflict doesn't go ahead and cause indiscriminate harm to other space activities. That's a standard test for almost all military things that we do. If you have a system that does indiscriminate harm, like chemical and biological weapons, like nuclear weapons, like landmines, like massive aerial bombardment, if you have cluster bombs, if you have weapons that cause indiscriminate harm, the international community has agreed that doesn't make sense to use those kind of weapons. So we should go ahead and think about how does that extend to space? What are the kind of weapons that extend to space that cause indiscriminate harm? And some of those weapons are weapons that cause debris. We saw that happen in 2007 with the Chinese attack on their own satellite, or test on their own satellite. And we saw the international outcry. Here's the funny thing. The creation of thousands of pieces of debris in space as a result of the Chinese test created an incredible consensus within a week or two around the world that purposely causing debris in space doesn't make sense. And that was a correct consensus. And that's a consensus that we should push. We, the US, should say, look, we should not go ahead and partake of activities in space that cause indiscriminate harm to the orbital regions in space or to other satellites. And amongst those things are such things as massive debris-causing weapons. So rather than trying to go ahead and sit over here and decide how do you outlaw the use of space weapons, which we all know are in our interest to use, what we should really be worrying about is how do I stand over here and figure out which weapons are incompatible with the way we want to go ahead and see conflict happening in space that would cause indiscriminate harm to other uses of space. So that's the first principle, which is a long, storied principle in warfare, outlawing weapons which cause indiscriminate harm, and we can go ahead and start to have a conversation about that. Number two, there's a concept in the laws of armed conflict, which many of you are familiar with, which is called proportionality and military necessity. The principles of proportionality and military necessity says you should only go ahead and take such actions militarily as is proportional to the military gain you're likely to go ahead and achieve. But we haven't defined what that means for space. We need to define that. We need to think about what that means. We all know, for example, that the GPS system is a system which is at the center and the nexus of many, many things that we do in the military. And quite frankly, it is one of the most effective space systems in assuring that we can precisely target adversaries. And so adversaries may want to go ahead and take GPS away from us. That's an understandable reaction to that. But if you took GPS away from the United States, or Galileo away from Europe, or GLONASS away from Russia, or Beidou away from China, by going ahead and taking down the ground station for those systems and eliminating the worldwide signal for many, 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 many days, months, weeks, or months, say through a cyber attack, that would have effects which were not proportional to the gain. You might be fighting a small regional conflict, but you've now affected safety and security of the world. That's probably not a proportional response. And we need to think about that. We need to think about what are proportional things to do in space and which things are not proportional. If we have hurricane seasons like we have right now, and we take out all the weather satellites at GEO and we cause millions of people to be at risk of hurricanes that are not being tracked, that's probably not a proportional response. And we need to think about that. Now, I'm not saying don't go jam GPS or don't go do something locally or regionally or temporarily for GPS, but we should come to an agreement that probably taking out the worldwide signal for an extended amount of time would be an unproportional use of military force, would not represent military necessity, and therefore should be outlawed on the international stage. We can get that kind of agreement. Those first two principles, the principle of indiscriminate harm and the principle of proportionality and military necessity, are sort of the national security related principles to what I want to talk about today. But let me go now to some of the things that go to the commercial world, because there are principles that we can pull from history that help us in the commercial world as well. Number one, and we all know this, we see all of the articles being written over the last several years on this, we need a way to go ahead and figure out how do we share this commons called space in a safe, effective manner. How do we set up rules for transportation and tracking and the definition of dangerous approach? How do we go ahead and establish the means by which many nations can exist in this commons called space and not put each other at risk? Those means don't exist today. We have a couple of guidelines which are agreed to, for example, the guidelines on deorbit, which requires us to deorbit satellites within 25 years. And as I reminded many of you last year, that deorbit guideline has nothing to do about safety in space. It has to do with safety on the ground. It's about whether or not we can predict how many people on the ground might live in a certain area 25 years from now when the satellite might deorbit, and whether we can calculate the human life risk. But that has nothing to do with safety in space. We have satellites in space today that finish their mission in 9 months, but will be up there for over 25 years, unguided, hard to track, and a danger to other space navigation efforts. We have systems that are launched today that we can barely track because they're so small. I'm happy that there are small satellites. I'm worried that we have a hard time tracking them. We need aids to navigation. We have aids to navigation on ships. We have aids to navigation on aircraft. Why don't we have aids to navigation on spacecraft? The reason we don't is because nobody has promulgated a view of how do we go ahead and set up common sense international standards for space traffic management and all of the things that space traffic management might involve. Now, in the past, you may have heard a lot of people in the national security community say, well, we don't want those because they'll inhibit our activities. Well, last I checked, the fact that there are international standards for aviation hasn't inhibited the Air Force's activities. And the fact that there are international maritime union regulations on how to do shipping hasn't inhibited the Navy's activities, all aside from the fact that we have a collision every once in a while in the Pacific these days, which is no laughing matter really, but I couldn't resist, I'm sorry. But these common sense rules that actually allow us to make profit in these domains. In fact, without those rules, you couldn't make profit in those domains. Those rules don't exist in space. If we expect our companies to be successful and to be able to fly thousands of satellites in constellation, we need to develop rules, and we, the US, need to lead those rules. Finally, last principle to talk about are principles of ownership and salvage rights in space. Today, the best we can tell is there's disagreement on whether or not the Outer Space Treaty outlaws or prohibits the taking of things from space for national appropriation. It does go ahead and say we cannot nationally appropriate things. It doesn't say anything about private appropriation. So if you're a space mining company, or you want to set up a hotel on the moon, in theory, you can't go ahead and say, this is my hotel area, and nobody else can come in this area, because there are no property rights in space. There's no ownership rights in space, or at least they're ill-defined, and there's argument back and forth about them. Now, the Congress, many of you are paying attention, the Congress passed a law 2 years ago that said we're going to allow US companies to go ahead and actually appropriate rights in space and to own things in space and to mine asteroids and those kind of things. Great for the Congress. But that doesn't necessarily mean the rest of the world recognizes that. 2 countries have done that so far, the United States and Luxembourg. But the rest of the world doesn't necessarily recognize those rights. And if the rest of the, we can go into Luxembourg later, but that's the one. Is there anybody from Luxembourg here? Good, thank you. We can go into why that is, but the problem is without international recognition that these ownership rights exist, the likelihood that somebody's going to invest their money, their capital, which is going to range in the billions of dollars, for unknown rights that somebody might contest in the world court becomes problematic. In fact, we have that same problem under the sea. Those same rules exist under the sea today, and they have prevented the exploitation of resources under the sea because capital investors won't invest in uncertain returns that they may or may not own. If we want people to do this, then we need to go ahead and establish rights of ownership in space. You know, it's funny, the sea is an interesting analog for many things in space. And so I found the following to be somewhat entertaining. Mineral rights under the sea are ill-defined, actually outlawed by the Convention on Seas that the U.S. hasn't signed. And as a result, there has been very little investment. But the one resource in the sea that nobody says, that people say you can own, is fish. And you know, I would argue fish are far more limited than minerals under the sea. The reason fish were excluded was the fact that we've been fishing for thousands and millennia, so nobody sought to outlaw them, although there is a move to do so. But I suggested perhaps we should think of asteroids as fish in space. And then there would be no argument we could go ahead and own asteroids. The second principle is rights of salvage. We need a way to clean up space, and we need a way to make it economically beneficial to clean up space. Many of you know there was a very close approach between 2 satellites about a year ago, a US DMSP satellite and a Russian meteorological satellite, and they came very, very close to one another. And had they collided, they would have made a much bigger debris cloud than the Iridium Cosmos collision back in 2009. And the problem is the Russian satellite was dead, the DMSP satellite was alive but non-maneuverable, and nobody has a way to go ahead and clean up these things, and people are afraid that if we allow salvage rights in space, which exist in the seas today, that somehow that would impinge upon our national security. And I would contend, no, you just need to go ahead and get agreement on what salvage rights mean. What does cleanup mean? How do you go ahead and allow people to do that? Because we need salvage rights in space if anybody's going to come up with an economic argument about how do we clean up some of this debris. So those are the 4 principles that I think that we should work on. And the lucky thing is the current administration has set up the mechanism to do it, the National Space Council. In the past, we've had no real single place to go to talk about these things and come to a national consensus within the U.S. about what should we do, and then go promulgate that on the international stage. But we do now the National Space Council. So my urging to Scott Pace and the members of the National Space Council is take up this question. How does the U.S. want to lead in space? If you don't like the 4 principles I've laid out, come up with 4 of your own, that's fine. But come up with principles that we can agree with that make sense based upon U.S. interests. Because you know what? If they make sense based upon U.S. interests, they probably make sense based upon international interests. This is not a U.S. uber alles approach. This is what's good for national exploitation of space, no matter if you're an experienced space nation or a space nation wannabe. Come up with those principles. Promulgate them, just as we did in the early 60s. Get agreement. Because we got a lot of things to do in space, a lot of exciting things from a national security and economic standpoint. And we're just not going to be able to get them done if we don't get the principles agreed to. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Well, as you know, we've scheduled time for Doug to be able to answer questions, and some of you have already submitted some through our electronic devices. I think it's got instructions up there to do it. And one of the first questions is, what's the role of commercial space actors in ensuring the stability of the national security space capabilities from your point of view?
Sure. Well, as I said during my remarks, this is a shared domain, and it's not just a shared domain between nations. It's a shared domain between national security concerns, civil concerns, commercial concerns, and international concerns. This is a shared domain. Commercial actors in space, I think, have an absolute expectation that their activities should be profitable over the long term, and that the government should go ahead and set up rules and regulations, which sometimes is a bad word, but it really isn't a bad word. If you've ever looked at how traffic was conducted in San Francisco in 1905, let me tell you, traffic rules are good. They keep people from getting killed. Okay, at the time, there was no rules, and there was a lot of problems. Luckily, we were only moving at 5 miles an hour. So commercial concerns should go ahead and expect government to set up rules for how do we act in space. They should expect in return the freedom to go ahead and do what they want to. And in fact, in the House this year has passed a space enterprise bill, whose name I can't remember exactly, which basically says deregulate a lot of these things that are happening in space that used to be thought about as impinging national security, but really don't. And we can have a great argument amongst friends about whether or not remote sensing activities is a threat to U.S. national security. I fall on the side of no, it's not. Let people take whatever pictures they want to anywhere, and if you don't like that, don't make your activities apparent to people. Okay, figure out a way, just like the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Iraqis and everybody else has figured out with the U.S. overhead imagery. The U.S. might need to go ahead and to allow commercial imaging activities to prosper. We may need to figure out ways to go ahead and assure that in that condition we still can do our activities. So commercial concerns should expect the government to set the rules that make it profitable, and the government should expect commercial concerns to take responsible actions to go consistent with their own nation's needs. That's the way it works everywhere else. That's the way it works on the internet. That's the way it works in aircraft, in aviation. That's the way it works in sea, and that's what commercial concerns should expect. So.
What are some of your thoughts regarding the establishment of a space force?
Well, gosh, we're out of time. So look, I come at this I can either come at this from the humorous standpoint or the serious standpoint. Let me do both. First of all, I know that there's going to be a space force. I saw Star Trek. Now, it was the wrong service, but nonetheless, okay? Seriously. Look, there are things that are happening in space that will require at some point in the future that we have a space force. And those things go well beyond the things we do in space today. It's not just about providing space services to ground forces. It's defending U.S. interest in, through, and from space. Who's in charge of missile defense for the United States of America as an organized, trained, and equipped mission? Nobody. How can no service be in charge of the organized, trained, and equipped mission for missile defense? Wouldn't that be the natural hallmark of a space force? Who's responsible for assuring that they are ready to go ahead and for those of you who aren't into military lingo, organized, trained, and equipped means those are the people who either bring the people into the service, build the equipage, or go ahead and train how to use it. They hand those over to a warfighter like STRATCOM to fight with, but the organized, trained, and equipped mission is a critical mission. Some people might say on the missile defense thing, wasn't that the Missile Defense Agency? No. They're just an acquisition organization. They're not an organized, trained, and equipped organization. Isn't it apparent to all of us that there's going to be conflict in space, and who's in charge of the organized, trained, and equipped mission to go ahead and defend our space assets? Nobody. It's apparent to me that sometime in the future, people are going to use space to go ahead and be a platform for attacking the U.S., either through kinetic means or non-kinetic means. And who's responsible for defending the United States' interests from attack from space, organized, trained, and equipped? Nobody. We need an organized, trained, and equipped force to go ahead and worry about these things in the same way that we have an organized, trained, and equipped force who would prevent those kind of things from happening on the sea. We call that the Navy, by the way. an organized, trained, and equipped force that prevents those kind of things on land, the Army, and an organized, trained, and equipped force that prevents those things in the air, which is the Air Force. We need that force for space. We are not ready for that quite yet. But we know the road leads inextricably there. And to pretend that it doesn't is to simply delay our readiness to go ahead and engage in this domain. So I'm very passionate that we should be moving on that road, and it worries me that oftentimes we have the debate that seems to be focused simply on who wins the debate, rather than what's the right thing to do for the future of the nation. That's the same place the Air Force found itself in 1918 when we created the Air Service. Thankfully, we got over that debate by 1947. By the way, the Air Force birthday was, I think, 2 days ago. Right? So in 1947, we got over that debate and we created the United States Air Force because we knew to defend U.S. interests in, through, and from the air, only an Air Force can do that, not an Army Air Corps, not an Army Air Service. And the same will be true in space, but you got to get on the road, and we seem to be hesitant to get on that road.
How do we deter a nation with little presence in space who may cause incredible harm from violating one of your principles and see that as in their interest?
Well, did you say deter, Kurt? Is that what you said? Look, the Chinese, after they did their attack on their own satellite in 2007, have done subsequent tests. All of those subsequent tests have been without causing any debris. Why is that? They were deterred because the overwhelming consensus response from the rest of the world was that's not a good thing to do. In fact, even the Chinese figured out that's not a good thing to do. And that's fantastic. I mean, that kind of consensus, isn't it strange that we came to that consensus and yet sitting at a negotiating table, we don't seem to be able to negotiate that consensus? That's just amazing to me. I mean, I guess that's why we have diplomats. But that was not a compliment to diplomats, by the way. So I think you deter by going ahead and establishing common principles and then an expectation that countries will follow those principles. And if they don't, we have all the tools in the tool bag that we need, from sanctions to condemnations to military action to whatever it is. The same as in any other domain. Now, what we need to do as space people in the military and for national security, we need to make sure that if those actions do take place, it doesn't harm our ability to conduct the national security activities that we do. And that's, of course, part of the reason why for the last 4 or 5 years we've all been so focused on resilience and mission assurance in space. Because whether it's an attack by somebody who intends to attack us or an unintended collision in space, the truism has to be we still need to be able to conduct national security activities in the face of those happenings.
Along the lines of international cooperation, how do you foresee the need for space traffic management, and how do you address those things of sovereignty and things of that nature that really are difficult to define? Sure,
that's a great question, Kirk. Look, we all have national air traffic management and national seaway or maritime management rules that we use within our own waterways and within our own airspace. But we found out back in, it really began with the International Telecommunications Union, which was really originally the International Telegraph Union back in about 1846. We said, you know, this electromagnetic domain is getting a little bit crowded. We probably need rules between us as nations on how we're going to share that domain. In the 40s and the 50s, as air transport across national boundaries became standard, or sea transport became the predominant means by which we executed trade on the high seas, we created the International Maritime Union, or the International Civil Aviation Organization, to go ahead and coordinate rules for these domains. Again, we're not giving up any of our sovereign rights when we do this. We still, as a U.S. Navy or as a U.S. commercial concern, we can sail anywhere we want to, anytime we want to, and nobody can tell us not to. But if we all want to get along in these common domains, we follow these rules because they make sense and they increase our profitability. They increase our national security. They don't diminish it. So do they change sovereign rights? No, they don't change sovereign rights. but they make it possible for us to all coexist in this domain, and that's good for all of us.
One last question. You've had the opportunity to see how the Department of Defense works or doesn't work. And space being one of those areas that has to compete in priorities, just as all the other services and capabilities are, what do you think the biggest opportunities or the biggest impediments are to being able to raise that priority to the level that all of us sort of think is necessary?
Sure. This goes a little bit back to the organizational question, but let me expand it a little bit since I already gave that soapbox speech. You know, it used to be that the priority for space activities within the DoD was incredibly high. Back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, the priority for space activities was incredibly high. Quite frankly, to quote from Jurassic Park, we spared no expense. And the reason was because our leadership was focused on how space activities impacted critical national security concerns, mostly concerned with nuclear war and war with the Soviet Union. But even more importantly, because we had senior leaders who knew they were in charge of making sure that domain was safe for national security. And those senior leaders changed over the years from the director of DDR&E, the director of Defense Research and Engineering, back in the 60s and the 70s and into the early 80s, to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Command, Control, Communications, and Intelligence, ASDC-3I, in the 80s and in the 90s up until 2000. Those people, those individuals knew they were in charge and that if we were going to go ahead and get there, they had to go ahead and make it happen. So when the Air Force, Army, and Navy, for example, walked into Bill Perry's office as the DDR&E back in 1972, and each of them proposed an alternative navigation system, space-based navigation system for the U.S. military, Bill Perry said, you guys get together, come up with one idea, come back to me, and when you come back to me with a good idea, I'll approve it. And over Labor Day weekend in 1972, the GPS system was born. Bill Perry approved it. That budget year, he went ahead and made sure that that money was provided to the Air Force as the lead service, and we have GPS today. That's because Bill Perry knew he was in charge. If you go around the Pentagon today, you don't know who's in charge of space. There are 7 direct reports to the Secretary of Defense who all own a little bit of space, but nobody's in charge. So trying to get a decision, and for those of you who are the unfortunate happenstance of having to come to the Pentagon for a decision, you know you can't get it. If nobody's in charge, nobody can lead, and if nobody can lead, you can't get the priority. So you got to go ahead and put some people in charge. So you know there are a couple of things we need to do. We need to fix the organized training and equipment mission. I talked about that today. We need to figure out which OSD office is going to be the lead for space, and we need to let that office lead. And I don't care who it is, just let somebody lead. Because once somebody leads, they know they have the responsibility to make it happen. Thank you.
Well, Doug, as usual, we could probably go on for quite some time. You haven't run out of good thoughts yet, nor will you in the future. I hope that you continue your writing and letting opportunities for us to hear these comments at various conferences and things. So again, we thank you for being here for 28 hours this year versus 26 or 24 of last year. So with that, we're going to go ahead and again thank Doug for his attendance.
Thank you.